In this presentation, I'll present the results and findings from a recent study on the public perceptions of transportation fees in North Carolina. Substantial attention has been paid to the changing transportation revolution. However, less attention has been paid to the challenges to the long-term sustainability of the revenue streams that fund our transportation system. Related to this, there's an interest in understanding public perceptions of the current transportation fees and taxes and thinking about how those may affect future transportation taxes and fees. And we know that these will likely vary by demographic group. Many states are exploring alternative funding mechanisms, and some have even implemented pilot programs to further explore those alternatives. This survey was designed to better understand how the North Carolina public perceives transportation fees and taxes. And one of the general findings was that support exists for increasing road funding. There is a preference for the current gas tax, but that support does exist to diversify funding sources. We consulted the state of the practice and literature in this area for developing our survey. The demographic questions we included in our survey were all variables that have been found to have a significant impact on road financing preferences and opinions in other studies. So when we look at this table, across the columns we have various dependent variables from various state and national studies. The rows represent various independent variables. And what we're showing in the actual cells, here we have positive, or the green cells, representing positive correlation between the independent and dependent variable, and the red cells represent negative correlation between that respective independent variable and the dependent variable. As an example, higher levels of education were generally found to be related to higher support of various funding mechanisms for transportation, so we see that there on row 2. Another example, we can look at the bottom row on the independent variables. We can see political party affiliation, and we see that Democrats support higher and various funding types across these studies. Another couple examples, we can look at employment and miles driven, so we see those as rows in this table. These are some that we may expect have some impact, but studies thus far have found that they either weren't significant or weren't included in these studies. So the primary focus of our study was to conduct a survey. We had a sample size of 2,245 individuals. This was a statewide survey, so we had coverage across the state, and we did apply weights to represent the overall state population. Before we jump into the details of our 2019 study, I'm going to take a slight step back. We're going to go back to the 2018 statewide customer service survey. This is an NCDOT survey, and one of the questions we included was included on this study was asking North Carolinians how much they believe they were currently spending on transportation fees and taxes. And the result of this one question on this single topic was that almost 75% of North Carolinians believe they currently spend more than they actually do. So the estimate of actual transportation fees and tax expenditures, this came from Bert Psycho's presentation on July 12th, was around $770. The 2018 customer service survey had a range, that middle 50% range was between $500 and $2,000, so half the people in the state responded in that range, and that was the middle 50%, with a median of $1,000 and an average of $1,600. Now, jumping into the results from our 2019 study, we're going to see a series of slides that look similar to this when presenting the results. So we're going to see on the left some general results from that survey question, either in the form of a bar graph like this or a pie chart. On the right side of the screen, we're going to see line graphs that show us some of the differences between certain demographic groups. So in this question, we asked what people thought the current gas tax was. We wanted them to think about both the state and federal gas tax rate. For this question, the correct answer was approximately 55 cents, so it goes in that middle category. That was the plurality of responses, but it was still less than 30% of respondents selecting that correct answer. So very few respondents correctly answered that, a little bit more than a quarter of the respondents. And the majority of respondents actually responded to a value that was lower than that. So most people thought they actually paid less on a per gallon basis than they did guessing the correct answer. We can look at these demographic groups and see some differences. So in these line graphs, we see anything that's in the red font, that's a group that has a statistically significant difference between those two groups. So we see that for males and females, for education level, and for vehicles in the household. The total set of categories we have, or groups that we have, are urban and rural. We have a gender category, an age category, education level, political party identification, miles driven, and number of vehicles in the household. So we do see some differences between groups there and some that don't have substantial differences. Our next question, we asked people how they felt about transportation spending, whether it should be increased, decreased, or have no change. And the majority of individuals believe that road funding should be increased. And this occurred in all categories except higher educated individuals and Republicans, although each of those are close to 50%. And we do see a fair amount of these groups that do have differences between the categories. In our next question, we asked where road funding should come from. And there's really roughly a 50-50 split here. In the two categories we gave them, we only gave them these two categories: general taxes, which include sales tax, property tax, vehicle property tax, and usage-based fees, so fees that are more closely tied to the actual usage of the roadway. And we told them the examples of these are gasoline, tolls, or some kind of fee based on miles driven. So roughly 50-50 split here. Some of the groups that did have preferences for the usage-based fees included those who were older, more urban, those who drove less than 30 miles a day, and males. So we do see some of these groups do have statistically significant differences, and some of those are more closely aligned than others. For our next question, we expanded the set of options, but got a little more specific on which ones we would like them to choose from. So we asked them to rank 3 choices on how transportation should be funded, based on either the fuel used, the miles driven, or the weight of the vehicle. And so you can see that there wasn't a whole lot of variation, although the fuel used was the most popular option. There were still a substantial number of people who believe that miles driven and vehicle weight are an important part and should be considered for used for funding transportation. And this was fairly consistent across the demographic groups, other than age, where younger respondents favored vehicle weight instead of fuel used. We wanted to understand a little bit about fairness, and so we told our participants that someone who drives approximately 15,000 miles in a year would pay approximately $400 in gas tax, and the majority of respondents believed that $400 is fair. Some of the groups that were less likely to think that was a fair amount were females, individuals with less than a bachelor's degree, and multiple vehicle households. And we do see some of these groups do have significant differences, although some of the groups do not have differences in terms of whether or not they considered $400 to be a fair amount to pay for driving 15,000 miles. So looking a little more closely at at what the options are for funding the transportation system. We asked specifically about miles driven and gas tax. A lot of states are looking at miles driven, so we wanted to focus in on that as a potential option for our state and understand people's preferences there. So we see about a 1/3, 2/3 split, with about a third of the state supporting a miles driven funding system compared to the gas tax at approximately 68%. And this is fairly consistent with other studies. A summary of 33 studies found a 24% overall support for mileage-based user fees, and they found that support levels did not differ much according to whether the question was framed as general support or more specifically as replacing the gas tax. Another study found that there was a 40% increase in support of increasing the federal gas tax by 10 cents per gallon. And when given a specific rate, a Georgia study found a 39% support level for a 1.6 cents per mile tax. These were fairly consistent among the demographic groups. We said a couple of groups did have significant differences between the two, but for most practical purposes, most of these groups were very similar with each other. Perhaps just as importantly as what the overall responses were here, we wanted to know a little bit about the reason why people selected either the gas tax or the miles driven fee. And overwhelmingly, we saw fairness as an important issue. So when looking at the miles driven fee, 78% is our estimate for those who thought that the miles driven fee provided that level of fairness and was a reason to select it over the gas tax. As an example of one of these responses, and we didn't provide them with categories, this was a free response, so they responded the way they wanted to, and then we coded these into the various categories we see here on the graph. So in terms of fairness, they thought that it would make sure that everyone contributed, and in this case even electric car drivers, which wouldn't be subject necessarily to a gas tax. And there were other reasons, but overwhelmingly miles driven fee supporters thought that fairness was a reason to move towards a miles driven fee scenario. When looking at the reasons for selecting a gas tax, although the plurality selected fairness, there were a lot of other reasons why people selected the gas tax instead of the miles driven fee. One of the reasons why fairness played a role is they thought that it really is, the gas tax is a fair system because people pay an amount of fuel that's commensurate with the size and efficiency of the vehicle and the amount of miles that are driven by that vehicle. But people were also concerned about logistics when responding in support of the gas tax. They felt that you could possibly cheat if you're reporting your mileage, that the gas tax was built into the fuel purchase and not some separate bill to pay, so adding on to the administrative burden if you switched from the gas tax to a miles driven fee. Environmental was also an important consideration. So 10% responded that the gas tax was preferable from that perspective, and they thought that taxing fuel usage will encourage fuel conservation, which will reduce environmental impact. Privacy is also a concern. We hear about it regularly when people talk about miles driven fees, but it really didn't show up as a large concern or a large number of the responses, although 3% who supported the gas tax did mention a privacy concern, and they just felt that the possibility of having to track a vehicle's movement is an important consideration if you were to move away from the gas tax and towards a miles driven fee. We asked a very specific question related to hybrid vehicles. We told our participants that hybrid vehicles are typically more fuel efficient than gasoline-powered vehicles, and for that reason, drivers of a hybrid vehicle pay lower taxes for their use of the roadway because they travel further per gallon of gas purchased. And so we asked them whether or not they support hybrid vehicle drivers paying less to use the roads, or oppose. So overall, our estimate for this is that 37% support them paying less, and the remainder, approximately 2/3, oppose hybrid drivers paying less in tax due to that higher fuel efficiency. So roughly 1/3, 2/3 split. That does differ from a national study that actually found that 63% of people agree that environmentally friendly vehicles should be charged a lower fee per mile. But again, it was framed a little differently. That national study was more heavily focused on environmentally friendly vehicles and a charge per mile than necessarily the gas tax. So slightly framed differently, so there is some different wording in those questions that likely generated such disparate results. The groups that were most likely to support hybrid drivers paying less were Democrats, urban, higher educated, and young respondents. Maybe of note, we did ask people their vehicle type, and we asked them whether or not they had a hybrid or electric vehicle. Maybe not surprisingly, the hybrid drivers had an 80% support with this statement, although I would have maybe expected it to be a little higher. There were 89 respondents in that category, and electric car drivers had a 98% support for this statement of hybrid drivers paying less, although again there were only 15 electric car drivers. So small sample size, but on the order of what you would expect. We also asked our participants a very detailed question. We provided them a list of 8 options, and we wanted them to tell us how much each of these should contribute to revenue sources to pay for North Carolina roads. So here are a set of 8 options that we provided them, and what we're showing here on this graph is the actual percentage. So we see ranked from top to bottom, the gas tax provides the largest contribution to funding our state's roads, then motor vehicle and driver's license fees, the highway use tax, the alternative fuel fee, and then tolls. Some of the things that we listed as option but actually aren't currently included in contributing to roads: general sales tax, property tax, and vehicle miles driven user fees. But these are all options that we wanted to provide to our participants. So those are the blue bars that we're showing, the actual contribution currently. We asked our participants and we split them into 2 categories. So one set of respondents got a survey question that just asked them to fill in how much they should contribute. That's our baseline, so that's the orange or the brown line. The green line represents the respondents who were told what the current contribution is. So we told them that the gas tax was this large of a percentage and that alternative fuel fee is this much, and that some of the other ones are 0%. So the additional information, the green line, those people were given a survey that actually told them the current percent, because we were interested to see if that reference point influenced what they would ultimately select. So we see that it looks like that does have an effect. We see that green line tends to be closer to the blue bar. In every instance, it actually is closer to the blue bar compared to the baseline survey respondents. What we do see in most cases, in a lot of cases, the baseline and the additional information groups are actually fairly close together, and some of them they actually look like the lines almost overlap. Another thing that's interesting in this graph is that even though the vehicle miles driven user fee isn't a component, the people who received the additional information were told that it's not currently used. That was actually a fairly highly rated option for contributing to North Carolina's roadways. So in summary, North Carolinians in general support increasing transportation funding. They generally have a preference for the gas tax, but support a diversity of funding sources, as we saw in the previous question. They don't actually or accurately know the current gas tax rate, or they believe it's lower than it actually is. North Carolinians in general are split as to whether road funding should come from general taxes or usage-based fees. They generally believe that $400 a year in gas tax is a fair amount of money to spend to travel 15,000 miles. And they hold similar beliefs on these opinions despite being from urban or rural counties. We thought urban and rural would be a much stronger indicator of people's preferences, and it turned out not to be as strong as we anticipated.